Rebecca is going to be talking about space. Not the final frontier, but what, when I was young, was called outer space, which since then, through extraordinary technological developments, has become part of our world. And she's going to be talking about the challenges that that's presenting, particularly in the matter of governance. Now, something about the speaker. Rebecca was a graduate from Victoria University, a BA and LLB with honours. Last year she was a recipient of a Fulbright scholarship award in science and innovation, and as a result of that completed a course at Columbia in Master of Laws. She had some specialisations in that, such as cyber security, information privacy, the law in the internet. I'll simply ask you to come forward and tell us what those problems are. Thank you, Rebecca.
All right. So this is going to work, right? Excellent. Okay, well, President Marion, Rotarians and your guests, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real honour to come and speak to you all. So I am originally from the Waikato, but I have had Wellington as my adopted home for quite a number of years now. And this is not actually the first time I've ever spoken to a Rotary Club, because when I was 18, I was a Rotary International Scholar and I went to France. And I spent a year in a French high school, living with French families. I had 4 different host families, and every couple of weeks, not every week, I would go to the Montbrison Plaine de Forêt Rotary Club, which was an all-male Rotary Club, and had a brilliant time. So I just want to acknowledge Rotary for giving me the opportunity. It was absolutely life-changing and eye-opening. And yeah, it was fantastic. So if you're involved in that, I really encourage this club because it's a fantastic opportunity for young people. So we're going to fast forward a couple of years. And again, I'm back in front of a Rotary Club and I'm talking about my overseas experiences. So, as Brian said, I've recently returned from America. I've returned from New York, been living there for a year with my family, undertaking a Master of Laws at Columbia University. And I couldn't have done this without the support of Fulbright New Zealand, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have some Fulbright family here today. And here we go. Just a couple of snaps, just a few. So I'm really lucky in that my family were able to come with me. I have 2 children. Sam is 4.5 and Thea is 2.5, and we just got to experience New York as a family, as their favourite place in New York are the stones outside our apartment building and the Museum of Natural History. So it was just an amazing year. It was challenging, it was eye-opening. The access to the different professors at Columbia were fantastic, and the subject matter was also amazing. Excuse me, my notes have just turned off. It's a good start. Apologies, technical difficulties. Okay, I've been interested in for a number of years about the changes and the challenges that the cyber realm has been bringing to our lives. And I was really lucky that I was able to focus on this at Columbia. So Columbia does a course-based Masters of Laws, and so I was able to take a number of courses, and I tried to focus my courses on cybersecurity, anything to do with technology law, and a bit of national security and intelligence in there as well. So I'm here to speak briefly about the challenges that the commercialisation of space is bringing to our extremely fast-paced world. This topic came up in one of my classes called National Security Law and Policy, and it was taught by a woman called Avril Haines, who is absolutely phenomenal to start off with, and you may not know her name, but she was actually the first female deputy director of the CIA, and the first female deputy national security advisor in the Obama administration as well. So incredible brain, incredible experience, and just a wealth of knowledge in these areas. So of course the first thing we asked her was, are there aliens? But she wasn't able to tell us, it's classified. So first of all, we're just going to do a crash course in space science. So if I ask you what is space, you know, the answer is going to be very obvious. It's everything that's up there. But, you know, we're lawyers, so we like to have definitions. So most countries will accept that outer space, it's still called outer space, but it's okay, starts at about 100 kilometres up. So there's a little bit of leeway in here. The United States will tell you you're an astronaut if you get to about 88 k's up, and then there's something funny that happens with gases in their states at about 112, but roughly 100 is sort of the line that outer space starts. And what you may not know, is that there is actually a couple of different types of orbits out there. So you have the low Earth orbit. I tried to focus in on this a little bit. So the low Earth orbit is this little blue bit that's the closest to Earth. And this is where you have Sputnik, the International Space Station, the Hubble telescope. If you're the kind of person who goes out and looks at the Earth, at the night sky, and you see a very fast tracking shiny object, that's a satellite in the low Earth orbit. They go very quickly around the Earth. They travel around the Earth numerous times in a day, and it's a great orbit for taking pictures of the Earth. Next you have the medium Earth orbit, so this green patch here, and this is where you get your GPS satellites. So GPS satellites, they orbit twice in a day, and that's all I've got to say about that. Now, if we go back a little bit, this patch here, this end, it's called the Geosynchronous Orbit. So if you put a satellite right there, sort of in the line between the red part, the high Earth orbit, and the medium Earth orbit, your satellite will be fixed, and it will be planted there, and it will travel at the same speed as the Earth. And so you can put, for example, a satellite that deals exclusively with New Zealand and provides services exclusively to New Zealand in the geosynchronous orbit just above New Zealand, and that'll travel as fast as we are going. And then you have the high Earth orbit, which, as you can see, there's not a lot there until you get to the moon. Right, so quickly, who governs it? What are we talking about here? The governance of outer space started with the space race, basically. So if you think of the context, we're talking Cold War, nuclear arms, and so in the late 50s, early 60s, the United Nations General Assembly established a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. They negotiated a treaty in 6 months, which is absolutely phenomenal, completely lightning speed for the UN, which has the wonderful name Treaty on the Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, which we just call the Outer Space Treaty. So this treaty precludes any claim of national sovereignty in space or on celestial bodies, and permits all states to freely explore outer space, so including the Moon and asteroids, planets, Mars comes to mind. So the treaty, its main purpose at the time was to prohibit the use of nuclear weapons in space, or weapons of mass destruction up there. Everyone was terrified that that was going to be the next frontier, so that was the main aim of that. So in the years since then, in the 60s and 70s, there was a number of agreements, and they mostly dealt with this issue of weapons in space, not putting things up there, using it peacefully, and also liability. So the states decided that the launching state was the state that would hold the liability for whatever happened with whatever it was that they were launching up. So if they launched it, if they procured the launch from another territory, then they were liable for any damage that that object caused in space. And the other thing that they agreed was that we needed some kind of registration. You needed to tell the UN if you were going to send things up in space, if there were things in space, if your satellites broke down or if they broke up, because space debris is becoming a bit of an issue. So as you can see, space was originally the domain of the nation state. You had big players, you had Russia and USSR, you had the United States. And now we fast forward to today, and governments are increasingly looking to the private sector to do launches and provide satellites. So government spending is on the decline, and private investment in tech startups that aim to accelerate the commercialisation of space has increased something like 2,000% since 2012. You've got your key players, SpaceX, you probably have heard of, Mr. Elon Musk. His goal is to reduce space transportation costs and enable the colonisation of Mars. There's a great quote from him about how he wants to die on Mars, just not on the impact. Then you have, but what you may not know, so SpaceX are currently developing Falcon launch vehicles and Dragon spacecraft. So these are the rockets that will go up and then come back down and can be reused. They've actually flown about 14 resupply missions to the International Space Station at the moment under a partnership with NASA. So then you have OneWeb and I think it's, you say it, O3b networks. These are they're called satellite constellations. So what they want to do is to put up hundreds of satellites in microsatellites, so just little satellites that will provide internet services to tons of people and communications. So OneWeb wants to put up about 650 microsatellites into the low Earth orbit, and O3b Networks wants to put up another couple of hundred, but into the medium one, which now you know where that is. So it's distinctive. Then of course you have Virgin Galactic, space tourism. Going to put some commercial provider to put people up there, which I'm sure will cost an arm and a leg, and our own Rocket Lab, who we're all very proud of, who are involved in developing lightweight, cost-effective commercial rocket launch services. So basically to help the OneWeb and the O3b networks putting small satellites up there. So the overall effect of this sort of commercialisation of space is that it's no longer a one-state game. You can have, for example, a rocket launching from Mahia, so under the New Zealand liability. It can be a US rocket, it can have a French payload, which is like the satellite that you put up there, and you just kind of get a big complex web of who's in charge and what it looks like and who's responsible. So, what does this mean? We need a practical international approach. Our framework is hopelessly outdated, impractical, a bit of a relic, and what has happened is the UN has put it on spacefaring states, so states like New Zealand, because we have our launch pads, to basically regulate the situation. So it's up to the individual states to enact legislation to set up a licensing regime to make sure that everything's going to be safe, decide what goes up there, and to also decide any mitigation on space debris, so what happens when it's no longer needed or it breaks up in orbit. So New Zealand actually has one of the most recent pieces of legislation on this. We entered the space game about, in the last year and a half. And so we have the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act administered by MB. And so under this act, there's a list of things that a minister has to be happy with to grant a licence. So mitigation plan for debris, compliance with New Zealand's international obligations, and also the minister has to be happy that it's in New Zealand's national interest and it's not a national security risk to grant this licence. So Rocket Lab has a licence under this Act, and it's allowed to launch every 72 hours for the next 30 years. So the problem with this situation is that each state enacted these things at different points in time. So you had states who enacted them really quickly, and then of course we've got the latest one. And so you could have a less scrupulous state who was willing to shop around the different licensing regimes to put something slightly dodgy up into the atmosphere. So what we really need is we need an international body that organises this, that can set standards, that there's a bit of transparency around, and that also can coordinate efforts on space debris. So what I'm going to show you now is a quick graphic on basically there's just a picture of what is out there. So hopefully we can start a little bit further along. Oh, we can show the whole thing if you want. That's all right, if you want to show the whole... I was going to start in 2000. that's real. I mean, obviously it's a computer simulation, but all of those dots are space objects, and unlike most, the laws of physics, what goes up doesn't actually come down, it just kind of hangs out there. And so what you can see is the GPS satellites there that sit in that larger ring, the geosynchronous, the middle Earth orbit. Anyway, so it's a little bit terrifying. I mean, we're kind of running out of space in space. And so we need some kind of body that's going to regulate these orbits and tell you where you can launch and what orbit you can sit in. Kind of like, if you want an analogy, you could look at the civil aviation. So a body that sort of says these are the routes that you can take and this is when you can take them. So that's one of our main problems. Second main problem is keeping our space assets secure. So this is where space and cyber kind of interact quite a lot. So if you think about just for a minute what in your life is actually riding on the space assets just at the moment, it gets a little bit scary. So you think about your communications, you can think about all of the infrastructure that we have, GPS locating, directing people, collecting data, collecting intelligence. There's a whole number of things that are actually riding on our space assets. And so with commercialisation, it's only going to get more of our lives dependent on space assets because it's going to be easier to get payloads up there. So it isn't terribly far-fetched to consider that a space asset could be used in some kind of conflict to create chaos and disruption. So there's two ways that this could probably happen. You can have a kinetic attack for something they're called anti-satellite weapons, or you could have cyber attacks, which can be performed from anywhere and could exploit ground stations and data links used to command and control the satellites. And I don't want to be a fearmonger, it's the start of the week, but unfortunately these aren't actually sci-fi. In 2008, China managed to blow up one of their satellites, one of their own satellites. It wasn't working anymore, and so they would just take it out. And then there have been a number of reports in the last couple of years about tests of anti-satellite weapons up in space at different levels of orbit. Also, in 2008, I think it was a bit of a difficult year, hackers managed to access a ground station to take control of a NASA satellite, a research satellite. They pretty much did everything apart from give the satellite some commands to do something, but I think that may have caused a bit of consternation at NASA. So the question is, who's going to protect them? Whose job is it to protect them? And we come back to the nation state. They're liable for them, they need to protect them. It's their populations that depend on them, so it's up to them. So then we're back in the realm of traditional diplomacy and traditional international law. And now, up until the current US administration, the position has been a defensive one. So they will only react if threatened, basically. But there's been a slight change of tack in the last couple of months.
When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important. Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement. We are going to have the Air Force and we are going to have the Space Force, separate but equal. It is going to be something so important. General Dunford, if you would carry that assignment out, I would be very greatly honored also. Where's General Dunford?
Yeah, General Dunford was actually sitting behind him. So, yeah, it's, on the one hand, this is pretty alarming, but take heart, just because President Trump has declared that it shall be so, it's not quite so just yet. It still has to go through congressional approval, and there can be a couple of roadblocks there. And it is a little bit scary if you think about it too hard, because for the whole of the space realm, the states have been working together to try and stop the weaponization of space. So this sort of seems to be a bit of a 180 on the traditional international law position on space. However, if we go back to thinking about exactly how much of our lives rely on space assets, it might be a good thing to have an ability to protect those assets. So, basically, one thing is clear, this is going to affect all of us, it affects all of our lives, and especially the US is one of our traditional allies, so it's worth keeping an eye on. On that note, it's a little bit dark, I'm sorry about that for your Monday lunchtime, but that's all the remarks that I had actually prepared. So if you have any questions, feel free to.
We have time for some questions, so William.
With all that debris flying around space, don't they have, I know it's very big, but don't they have a risk